With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
And welcome to the program, everybody. Thanks so much for being with us right here on Tactics, whether you are watching us on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, Twitch, Periscope, whatever venue you are watching us on. We certainly appreciate you allowing us to be a part of your day here on Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. Well, we appreciate you being with us here on the program, and as always, your local news takes top priority, so we're going to go ahead and dive right into that. I know that a lot of people on the national stage are talking about another big exit on the national stage when it comes to the Democrat primary. Of course, we're going to mention that at least a little bit later in the program with Kamala Harris, but right now there's bigger news on the local front, and that is that John Merrill, the current Secretary of State for the state of Alabama, who was running for the Senate position that was left vacant by Jeff Sessions, then occupied by Doug Jones, running for that seat, he has now announced that he is no longer going to be seeking that office. So that's something that we really weren't expecting. I know that I wasn't expecting for him to get out because he's one of the stronger candidates currently in that race. I wouldn't say that he's the strongest by any stretch of the imagination or by anybody's definition, but he was one of the higher level candidates. Now, the interesting thing here is that recent polling does suggest, and I think that this is probably his rationale behind his decision, that he is not one of the top tier candidates and that he would have very little chance at making it even into the runoff, much less winning the thing outright before the runoff even took place. And because of that, he's probably looking at the numbers and looking at his odds and saying, you know what? The odds just aren't worth it. Now, this bothers me because Merrill was my guy. I mean, he was the one that I was going to go with. Ideologically, the person in the race that I probably align with the most is Arnold Mooney. But the problem with Arnold Mooney is nobody knows who the guy is. I like Arnold Mooney, I do. But I follow politics for a living. They pay me to do this. And when they announced that Arnold Mooney was going to be running, I had to look him up to remember exactly who he was. Like, I had a vague idea of who he was, but I had to check to make sure, hey, am I thinking about the right guy now? That's never a good sign. That's not a good sign for a normal person that just kind of pays attention to the news. When the news people in your state have to look up who you are to make sure that is the guy I'm thinking of, right? That's a really bad sign for your campaign. And I hate that I have to talk about him like that, but because I like Arnold Mooney, but he just has no shot at this point. And John Merrill, who had seemingly at least something of a shot, a long shot maybe, but at least had a chance to be one of the winners in this primary, he's now saying, you know what, I'm out. And I really do think what that goes down to is, I think that he's looking at the numbers and just saying, you know what, I have a chance, but is that chance, as slim as it is, really worth spending hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions in a campaign? I don't know exactly how much he even had left. I imagine that Merrill was probably running on fumes at that point with the amount of money that he was going to need to continue to be a viable candidate in this race. And a lot of his other candidates have such a great name recognition that they didn't have to spend nearly as much on advertising as John Merrill did. And so I think, and Merrill is an incredibly frugal fiscal conservative, and that's probably one of the reasons he's like, yeah, we're spending an awful lot of money on a long shot gamble. And I don't know if he made the right decision or not. Weird things happen in politics all the time. Maybe if he'd stayed in, he would have been the guy. I certainly would have wanted that myself. But he's probably looking at the odds and saying the odds just don't justify spending all this money, all this time. And let's be honest, John Merrill, at least from every indication that I've ever got from the guy, is very happy being the Secretary of State and being where he is. And so maybe he's thinking, you know what, I'll just sit out my term. There's at least a decent chance that Shelby's Senate seat opens a little later. And so, yeah, who knows? Maybe that's what he's planning on doing. He's a younger guy. He's very dynamic. He's well liked by all the people that actually do happen to know who he is and have followed his career. He's a conservative. He's somebody that I think is going to be a real player in Alabama politics, if not national politics one day. And so I think that it's not necessarily a terrible thing that he's decided to drop back and punt and sort of reevaluate his strategy here and think, maybe we live to fight another day. It's not a terrible move. I personally am annoyed by it because now I have to bat back and forth between Bradley Byrne and Senator Sessions. And when I thought about that, and again, on tactics, I never tell you how to vote. I just tell you how I'm going to vote. You can agree with me, you can disagree with me, that's fine. And I'm going to give you information on all of these candidates because even after I've made up my mind, and I haven't done that yet, but even after I've made up my mind, I still want you to get the information to be able to make up your mind. But when it comes to who is in the race that's left, really the only viable candidates at this point are Tommy Tuberville, Bradley Byrne, and Senator Jeff Sessions, who used to hold this seat. Now, Roy Moore does have that solid, freakishly loyal base that will vote for him in any election, no matter what it is. As long as his name is beside it, they're going to put their check mark beside it. But you're talking about, I don't know, maybe 10% of the electorate at this point. And I've talked about Roy Moore so much previously that I'm not going to do it again. If you're interested in hearing my analysis on his candidacy, go back, look through the archives. I'm not going to waste your time repeating stuff I've already said. But when it comes to Roy Moore, I just do not see him having a path to victory with that base, since he doesn't seem to be able to garner any extra votes outside of that base, at least not this time like he did last time. And we actually are going to touch on something that Moore said here in a second. But the question is, was this really a smart move by John Merrill? Here's the thing. I think the only thing that Merrill could have salvaged his campaign at this point was something really strange happening. Because he was realizing he was in a crowded field and other candidates were really sucking up the air from where he was. And I don't think that it's necessarily a terrible call to end his candidacy with that, even though I'm personally annoyed by it. But really, his only shot at sort of getting that inner edge and then beating out the 4 candidates at this point that were ahead of him was something really odd was going to happen. Like Tommy Tuberville all of a sudden decided he didn't want to be in the Senate and drop out and then see where the votes go after that. Or Jeff Sessions decides, no, I really don't want to run for Senate even after waiting this really long time to think about it and jumping in the 11th hour. It's really weird that in politics, the 11th hour is like 8 months before an actual election, but it is. Just something really, really weird and completely unprecedented would have to have happened for John Merrill to have a shot at making it into the runoff. And so I think that he was looking at that, and he's also looking at it, and they have to be doing head-to-head matchups in their mind, thinking, does Bradley Byrne beat Merrill if they wind up in a runoff? Does Jeff Sessions beat does Jeff Sessions beat him in a runoff? They had to be going through those scenarios in their head, and he's probably looking at it and thinking, even if I make it to the runoff, there's not a great chance that I wind up beating whoever beat me in the first primary election. So I think that he was just hedging his bets, and he decided to play it safe and fold because he was, when you're sitting on 2 pair, you don't throw the whole pot in, and I get that. I get that he was kind of hedging his bets here. I still think that he was more viable than the majority of the field, but, that's just me. So here now becomes the question, because I've already kind of given you the rationale behind why this was actually a pretty smart decision. I don't think that it was like a sure thing, but I don't think him being viable was a sure thing either. And so he kind of saw the writing on the wall and exited stage left. So the question is, should everybody else follow suit? Should the other candidates that are still in it, that are not viable, that are not in that three-man race, drop out? I would say yes, because if John Merrill is looking at it and he can't even see a path to victory, then in my opinion, the three candidates that were either about neck and neck with him or below him in the polling should definitely consider bowing out. I think that Roy Moore should have never gotten in the race to begin with for other reasons. But the other candidates, like I said, there are even candidates like Arnold Mooney that fall into this category that I really like. But you have to be honest about it. There's really no chance that with his level of name recognition that he goes anywhere with this. And if this was a ploy, and people do this all the time, this is just the way that politics works. If this was a ploy to get Arnold Mooney's name out there more and to increase his knowledge base with people knowing what he stands for and who he is and that kind of thing, that's not even working. I mean, out of this election, he can't even get people to remember who he is. I've talked to people that are not, news hounds like me, but pretty well versed in local politics, and I'll say, and then there's Arnold Mooney that's running, and they're like, never even heard of him. People following this election don't even know who he is. And so I don't understand why Mooney would stay in the race. I mean, even if he's trying to pull an Eric Swalwell where he knows for dang sure there's no way he's going to win, but he's just trying to increase his platform, increase his name recognition, at this point, that's just not happening for you. And so I don't really see why he would stay in either. Now, here's the interesting thing, though. Because like I said, Roy Moore still has that crazy loyal base, but it's not going to be enough to propel him to victory in the primary. And yet, he has put out a new ad, and I did want to just go over it real quickly. So it's real short. It's a 30-second ad with Roy Moore. This is his new ad that he has put out. And, just keep an open mind and see what you think of it.
I'm Roy Moore, and I approve this message. The same Washington insiders who don't like President Trump are trying to stop our campaign. They just don't like conservatives like us. They call us warmongers for wanting to rebuild the military, racists for securing our borders, bigots for recognizing the sanctity of marriage, and they call us foolish for believing in God.
All right, so that's Roy Moore's new campaign ad. Now, I'm going to do something here because I think that it's going to be helpful, give you a little insight into this. I'm going to first observe the ad as somebody that doesn't care whether or not Roy Moore were to enter the primary and be the candidate against Doug Jones or not, or whether or not I thought he had a chance. I'm just going to observe the ad purely in a vacuum on its surface. Is it a good ad? Yeah, actually, it's a pretty dang good ad. Up until a point, and I'll get to my one criticism of it in a second. But in a lot of ways, that ad is the epitome of everything Roy Moore stands for that Alabamians like. Because you've got him talking about the military. Well, I mean, the guy is a military. This is a guy that was not just in the military. He's a decorated military veteran, an officer. And so, that's a great thing to bring up, that Roy Moore knows about the military, that he would be a staunch advocate for him, and nobody that knows Roy Moore, even if they can't stand the guy, would say, well, he's not exactly gung-ho on the military. No, he absolutely is. You've got him talking about the social issues that most Republicans shy away from, and the best thing about Roy Moore, for whatever you may dislike about him, is that he is not afraid to talk about the cultural issues. In fact, sometimes he does so much that it gets him, in hot water, depending on where you stand on that. But on the social issues, I actually tend to agree with most of what Roy Moore says. I think he takes it too far sometimes. But when you're looking at the issues, there was no crazy out of left field stuff. It was just these people inside Washington, inside that Washington Beltway, and in the media, they will attribute these horrible labels to you and call you racist, sexist, homophobic for just believing traditional, normal orthodoxy of the Christian faith and things that Americans and frankly the human race have believed for thousands of years. And somehow you're the one that is backward for, that's the case that they make. And Roy Moore is unafraid to take on those social issues. Now, sometimes I think you should use a little more caution in taking on those social issues, but that's one thing that Alabamians genuinely like about the guy. And so this is a very well done ad because it hits all the high points of what you like about Roy Moore without bringing up any of the stuff that you don't like about Roy Moore. And then there are two statements at the end of the ad. One is really good for stirring up his base. And that is that there was a misinformation campaign used against him in the last special election. That is 100% true. Now, there were a handful of claims that were at least viable in what they were claiming, but the claims themselves weren't all that bad. For all the ones that were accusing him of, touching children and all that, there was none of that was viable. There were some things that suggested that he was kind of a creepy older guy hitting on younger women. Now, yeah, that's true. And that's weird. And it's not a good look for Roy Moore. But they never were able to put together a even halfway compelling case that the stuff that he was accused of, the really bad stuff, was viable. And in fact, there were there were a couple of women that came out later and said, no, we basically made the whole thing up, or admitted to having planted evidence or made up parts of it, that kind of thing. So calling back and hearkening back to that, trying to drum up that revenge vote, that's actually a really smart move for Roy Moore, because even some of the Alabamians like me that did not want the guy to be the nominee and wound up eventually voting against him, it wasn't because of that. There were an awful lot of us that didn't want to throw our support behind Roy Moore, but that was not the reason. That was not the thing, because there was no truth to it. But then finally we get to my one big criticism of it. And it's so weird because it's the very last thing that is stated in that ad. It's kind of like, a great way to describe this would be if you're playing Freebird on the guitar. And I mean, you are just going to town, the crowd is into it, and you're playing it perfectly, making no mistakes. And then on the last segment, like basically the outro of the guitar part, all 6 of your strings break and you just fall to pieces on stage. Like that. You're tripping over the finish line, and not just tripping, you're like stumbling over and then skinning your face on the pavement at the finish line. This was a horrible finish for this ad. And this is in an ad that, like I said, everything was stellar up until that point. The last line in the ad, the last line is, we won't get fooled again. Does the Roy Moore campaign have zero sense of irony? Like, did they not see that and was like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't do that? That is a phrase that is so aptly applied to exactly what happened with the last election, with putting Roy Moore as the candidate. Roy Moore fooling voters into thinking that he was a viable candidate that didn't have a ton of baggage and was extremely weak going into a primary. The only candidate in that whole field that could have screwed up and wound up losing to Doug Jones was Roy Moore. And again, whether you love Roy Moore or hate him, regardless of your feelings about him, that was one of the dumbest lines that you could put in a campaign ad, because up until that point, it didn't remind you of any of the stuff that you don't like about Roy Moore. The fact that he's, in a lot of ways, politically damaged goods, and that he has a really hard time pulling together coalitions and winning elections. That phrase, putting that at the end of the ad, reminded everybody of that. They reminded everyone of his single biggest weakness. That he's done this before, that he's already tried to beat Doug Jones and face planted hard. I mean, he did this in a ruby red state. The reddest state in the country, if you're looking at Trump's approval rating as a gauge for that. And so it really is hysterical that he makes it through this entire ad and puts together all the things you love about Roy Moore, and at the tail end and says, oh, and by the way, you remember the thing that you hate about me the most? The fact that I'm basically the reason that you have Doug Jones. He's not the only reason, and I could go into that later, but I won't. That I was a big contributing factor in the reason that Doug Jones is now your senator. That's what that line reminds people of. And I don't know how on earth his campaign squad, his team looked at that as like, yeah, that's good. Let's run with that. How did they come up with that? I will say one other thing too, real quickly. I guess this is a secondary criticism. It's a lesser criticism, and you have to be pretty on top of things to get where it's coming from, or to understand it if you're not getting political commentary accompanying the campaign ad. But it was weird that he was like, Washington insiders are opposing our campaign. Well, now they are, but I've not heard them really vocally talking about how Roy Moore doesn't need to be, like, I'm not saying that no one has said it, but it's not exactly something that's running on CNN like it was the last time when he was running against Doug Jones in the general. That's not a thing that's happening. There's not a whole lot of Washington insiders trying to stop his campaign. And furthermore, the only people that I have heard be vocal about it, of trying to stop Roy Moore's campaign, the Washington insiders, presumably, would be President Donald Trump and his son. So that's also a little weird that they would be like, the Washington insiders are trying to stop our campaign. Well, the only people I can think of that have tried to stop your campaign are Trump and Donald Trump Jr. But anyway, so I think what's going on here is that in a lot of ways, the Roy Moore and the Roy Moore team is Drax the Destroyer from Guardians of the Galaxy. Like, things just go over his head now, and he doesn't get why. Like, I think that they looked at that ad and are like, yeah, well, we'll get the revenge vote from last time, and that's why we should remind people that we've done this before. No, that's the absolute worst possible thing you could have done. And that just went completely over their head, just like it would with Drax. But since this is now a three-man race, honestly, I think that I'm probably going to have to go with Bradley Byrne. That's really where my head is at right now. And just like all elections, I can still be swayed. Tuberville or Sessions still have the ability to make the case to me that they'd be better. But here's the thing. I look at Bradley Byrne's voting record, and then I look at Jeff Sessions' voting record. They're pretty close. They're both conservatives. But Jeff Sessions has been there a really long time, basically my entire life, and I'm 30 years old. I mean, almost the entirety of my life, Jeff Sessions was my senator. It's time for somebody else. And I think Bradley Byrne is a pretty good candidate. He's a conservative. He has conservative values. He has a conservative voting record. He's great on things like guns, abortion rights. Not abortion rights. Pro-life rights. He's good on First Amendment, free speech, freedom of religion. He's good on all of those things. And Jeff Sessions is too. So on paper, there's very little difference there. But the difference is Bradley Byrne is a lot younger, and he can be there for a lot longer than Jeff Sessions. Now, personally, I'd rather him just hang out for 2 terms and be gone. But being an advocate of term limits myself, I do think that after a certain point, you should just bow out gracefully and return to private life. And I think that really is the best thing for Jeff Sessions. I could be wrong, and you know, he's free to run if he wants to. But out of those two, I would probably pick Bradley Byrne. And right now, I have no reason to pick Tommy Tuberville. Thus far, almost. I used to say the only thing he's done. Now I say almost the only thing he's done, because he has, you know, he's shaken it up a little bit. Tommy Tuberville, as of right now, most of his campaign is just saying, I really like Trump, and I'll do what Trump wants. All he has done is try to ride the president's coattails. He hasn't shown, at least from my perspective, that he is a free-thinking individual that is making policy decisions that I would agree with, that he's basically just a surrogate for President Trump. And that's not a good thing. Even if you happen to really like Trump, I think you got to want somebody that does their own thinking. And I'm not saying that the guy just has to question everything or be a contrarian. I'm not asking for that. But when he's asked questions about issues, instead of actually answering the question and explaining how he got to that conclusion, his answer is pretty much always, well, I really like Trump and I think that we should go with whatever Trump thinks. I mean, it's usually a little better masked than that, but when you boil it all down, that's his answer about 99% of the time. And I don't want a yes man. I want somebody that actually believes these things because it's what they believe. And right now, Tommy Tuberville has done nothing to convince me of that. So if I had to vote right now, probably wind up going with Bradley Byrne. Now, we are going to do something a little bit different because you know that around this time, this is usually when I take my first break, frankly, because, talking for a solid hour is very difficult to do. And so I need a rest, and I try to entertain you with one of my comedy bits. Normally, that is what happens. But we do have Becky Garrettson, who just put out a new video that I think is really important. Now, normally what I would do here is I would just show the video and give commentary and make it a segment. I'm not going to do that because we actually have Becky Garrettson. She's got an interview that she's going to be doing with us sometime soon. We haven't nailed down a date yet, but I will let you know as soon as possible. And she's going to come and talk to us about this subject. But this video just gives you kind of a precursor, just a little intro to what she's going to be talking about, because what's going on is they're trying to pull a fast one on us here in the state of Alabama by switching the essentially the labels. Like they're trying to switch a packet of Oreos for a packet of Chips Ahoy and tell us that they're still Oreos even though you open it up, it's chocolate chip cookies. That's what's happening. That's a terrible analogy because that just made me hungry. But they're trying to do that with Common Core. They're trying to say, oh, we're reforming and we're getting rid of Common Core, and basically all they're doing is switching the labels. And so Becky's sort of detailing this, and we'll talk about this with Becky Garrettson of Eagle Forum, Alabama, probably sometime next week. But here's the clip in case you're interested.
Hi, I'm Becky Garrettson, the Executive Director for Eagle Forum of Alabama, and I have something urgent and very important to let you know. On December 12th, the state school board will be voting on new math standards, and we did a side-by-side review with Common Core state standards compared to the brand new proposed standards. And I personally went K through 6, and I wrote down where every new standard, I wrote down where they got it from Common Core. And you can just look at these highlighted areas. This is all Common Core. This is not new, as you can see. And the writing, like I said, shows exactly where it comes from. This is K through 6. There are some places where they have switched a sentence around, so the beginning of the sentence is now at the end. Or they've exchanged a word where it might say recognize, blah, blah, blah. It now says identify, blah, 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 or explain, blah, blah, blah. Now it says understand, blah, blah, blah. These are not changes in standards. There are a few word changes and some reformatting. In Common Core, some places they had things in a paragraph. Well, now it's the exact same words, but they put it in bullet format and vice versa. So we have a great guy who's been working with this, J.R. Wilson. Is a great math guy. He really understands Common Core, has been writing on it for years and years. He's an expert in the field, and he did a review for our Alabama's proposed new standards, K through 8, and he wrote a 9-page synopsis, not only detailing how exactly word for word it is Common Core, but he also lays out in here what is missing. Now, many of you remember when we learned math, we learned how to carry and borrow. That is the standard algorithm. You usually learn that in 2nd grade, maybe 3rd grade, but you have to have a fluent understanding of that. Common Core has never focused on the standard algorithm. They use all this weird, fuzzy math that nobody understands. Even the engineering parents who have these amazing degrees, they can't even help their kids with homework. Well, we have the same problem with these standards. Again, it is just like Common Core. There are hardly any differences whatsoever. And you will see this here in James's document. I wanted to let you know that down below there are links that you can go right to the Common Core website and see their standards. And then you can also go to the link for the proposed new standards, and you personally can compare them side by side and see for yourself. Don't just take my word for it. It's all there. You will see that it is Common Core. It's just repackaged, a few words changed here and there, but it is basically the same. We do have our 9th through 12th grade review coming out here shortly, but we don't have much time for you to help us get the word out. The vote is on December 12th. We need you to call your state school board and tell them that you are sick of Common Core, you are done with it, and check out those links below, and we really thank you for your help. Time is critical right now. Have a great day.
All right, and welcome back, everybody. Thanks so much for being with us through the break. Like I said, if you want more information on that, you can go directly to Becky Garrettson's YouTube channel, Eagle Forum, Alabama. You can check that out on YouTube. I'm sure it'll probably be one of the suggested channels that's right next to mine. So you can do that, and we're going to have her on the show probably next week to explain in a little more detail. So I did want to go through this video, and I actually got a request to do this. So this is not a new video. I had somebody come to me and request that I do a rebuttal to this video. So I took a look at it, and it actually is a pretty good one to rebut. It's something from Now This, and she just was asking for a little clarification. So this is at the request of a friend, but I think that you're really going to enjoy it. So with that said, let's go ahead and go to Breaking the Internet.
Where'd you hear that?
The internet.
And you believed it?
Yeah. They can't put anything on the internet that isn't true.
Where'd you hear that? The internet.
Oh, look. Here comes my date. I met him on the internet. He's a French model.
Bonjour.
All right, so on today's Breaking the Internet, this particular video was requested. It deals with Representative Katie Porter, who is a representative out of California, Democrat, and she's talking to Jamie Dimon, who is the CEO or the chief financial officer, I think. He's one of the big wigs, either way, at JP Morgan Chase. Anyway, so she's questioning him. This is actually on the House floor. So we'll go ahead and look at this clip real quick.
Mr. Dimon, you know how to spend $31 million a year in salary, and you can't figure out how to make up a $567 a month shortfall. This is a budget problem you cannot solve. You're an expert on financial statements, and you run a $2.6 trillion bank. I know you're good at numbers, and you've shared lots of opinions recently about how the U.S. should budget its resources, how families should budget their resources, and so I'd like to ask for your help on a problem. I went to Monster.com, and I found a job in my hometown of Irvine at JP Morgan Chase. It pays $16.50 an hour, and so I wondered if I could, if you'd indulge me, when you do the math on this and you do the $16.50 out at 40 hours a week for 52 weeks a year, it comes out to an income of $35,070. Now this bank teller, her name is Patricia. She has one child who's 6 years old. She claims the one dependent after tax. She has $29,100. We divide that by 12. She rents a one-bedroom apartment. She and her daughter sleep together in the same room. In Irvine, California, that average one-bedroom apartment is going to be $1,600. She spends $100 on utilities. Take away the $1,700, and she has net $725. She's like me. She drives a 2008 minivan and has gas. $400 for car expenses and gas. Net $325. The Department of Agriculture says a low-cost food budget, that is ramen noodles, a low food budget is $400. That leaves her $77 in the red. She has a Cricket cell phone, the cheapest cell phone she can get for $40. She's in the red $117 a month. She has after-school childcare because the bank is open during normal business hours. That's $450 a month. That takes her down to negative $567 per month. My question for you, Mr. Dimon, is how should she manage this budget shortfall while she's working full-time at your bank?
I don't know. I'd have to think about that.
Would you recommend that she take out a JP Morgan Chase credit card and run a deficit?
I don't know. I'd have to think about it.
Would you recommend that she overdraft at your bank and be charged overdraft fees?
I don't know. I'd have to think about it.
So I know you have a lot of...
to call her up and have a conversation about her financial affairs and see if we can be helpful.
See if you can find a way for her to live on less than the minimum that I've described.
Just be helpful.
Well, I appreciate your desire to be helpful, but what I'd like you to do is provide a way for families to make ends meet so that little kids who are 6 years old living in a one-bedroom apartment with their mother aren't going hungry at night because they're $567 short from feeding themselves, clothing them. We allowed no money for clothing. We allowed no money for school lunches. We allowed no money for field trips, no money for medical, no money for prescription drugs, nothing. And she's short $567 already. Mr. Diamond, you know how to spend $31 million a year in salary, and you can't figure out how to make up a $567 a month shortfall. This is a budget problem you cannot solve.
All right, so a couple things that you need to know with this. First of all, and this is important because it seems as though this is a hypothetical. And so there's a little bit of a bait and switch going on, because what you'll see is she'll say, I went to monster.com and I found a job. And so she's setting up a hypothetical. She's saying, I went and did some research and found one of the jobs at your bank. And then she throws in all these details with her having what her rent is going to be and having a child. And she's like, well, I looked up the rent. This isn't the budget of a real person. I don't know if she's using a real person that actually exists that happens to work at his bank and just sort of making up what her numbers would theoretically be, or she's just making up a fictitious person. But either way, she's not dealing with real numbers or a real situation. She is putting up a hypothetical with numbers that she found on the internet. Now, I'm not questioning whether or not her numbers are right. I'm not sure exactly how that would have come about, but it's important to understand that she's dealing with a hypothetical because she's not suggesting there is a person that is living with a $500 deficit and going in the red every single month, because how would that person even continue to survive and get food? And so you have to remember that, first of all, that we're not actually dealing with a person that actually is doing this and somehow managing to do so. So I'm not saying that all hypotheticals are bad or that they're not useful. I'm just saying let's not present them as though they are real, because that's where the bait and switch comes in. So what, first of all, she does is she admits that she's setting up a hypothetical using numbers that she found on the internet, but then she tries to, because she's trying to get that emotional pull, she's trying to get you to be worried about the real people involved in the situation. She either makes up a name or uses the name of somebody that works at the bank that doesn't actually use those numbers and doesn't actually have that budget. She uses that to try to create that emotional pull to think, oh, well, there's this poor single mother with a 6-year-old and they're starving to death because this man's only paying $16.50 an hour, which, by the way, is significantly more than the $15 an hour the Democrats say is the bare minimum, that is the living wage that everybody has to be able to have to survive. And so that ought to be a red flag right there, that the Democrats are saying this the second they get $15 minimum wage, they're going to say, well, how are you supposed to survive on that? I mean, this is basic understanding of that. So if you get that part of it, then you automatically understand that this is not something that is going to be viable. It's not something that you're not dealing with real people. I'm sorry, excuse me. I don't know why my phone is going crazy. I usually have it turned off. Anyway, sorry about that. So the second part of this that's really important to note is that Rashida Tlaib has already called for a $20 minimum wage. There have been other Democrats that have done this. So like the second that they get the $15 minimum wage, they're immediately going to go to, well, how are they supposed to live on $15 an hour? We have to go to 20. We have to go to 25. Why not make it, 50, 80, 1,000, a million? Like, that's the thing. They're basically using play money here. Because increasing the raw dollar amount that a person receives does not increase their wealth. Because after maybe a year or two, after the economy's adjusted, they wind up in exactly the same situation with the same amount of buying power that they had before the legally required minimum wage hike. And it actually does result in a loss of jobs and hastens the automation and innovation that winds up taking those jobs. And so there's a myriad of reasons why this is a bad idea. But chiefest among them is that they're trying to make the case that, well, we have to raise these people's wage to $15 an hour because it's the only way they can survive. And then the first opportunity they get, they take somebody that's making $16.50, a company that is offering more than what the Democrats say is the minimum wage that you need to offer, and they're chastising them, calling them greedy, and saying, no, you don't understand. People can't live on this. They're never going to be satisfied. And this shows that aspect of their ideology. And third, and this is the really big one, her premise is completely flawed. And part of the reason you cannot reach a correct conclusion here is because you do not have a correct premise. Because the argument is doomed right out of the gate if your premise is flawed. Because when you apply for a job, you don't ask how adding that salary impacts the company's budget or profit margin. You don't do that. Why? Because you're in it for yourself. And there's nothing wrong with that. When you go into a job interview, you don't sit down and go, I'm really interested in how adding me to the team and having to pay my salary, I'm really interested in how that's going to affect the company's profit and bottom line. Like, is that going to help the company? Is it going to hurt the company? You don't ask those questions. And for the same reason, the company doesn't ask you, so with the amount that we're paying, are you going to be able to pay your water bill? Are you going to be able to, afford a nicer car? They don't ask you those questions because that's not part of the negotiation. What happens is both parties go in probably wanting more than they're actually going to get. The company wants you for cheaper than you want to work for. You want more money for your work than they're going to offer, and then you wind up compromising and meeting somewhere in the middle. Now, sometimes that compromise is met before you even walk in the door, like you saw the job application, you saw how much it was going to pay, and you said, you know what, I would do that job for that amount of money, and you applied and wound up getting an interview. But my point is, whether you do it that way or you wind up in a negotiation, you come to a mutually beneficial agreement. Because you want the money to do whatever you want to with it, and the company really doesn't care how you spend it. And then the reverse of that is that you don't really care how they use your labor. You just say, I will do X for X amount of dollars, and that's how it goes. That's a free market system. Two people engaging in a mutually beneficial agreement voluntarily. And no, not everybody's going to get what they want, but it's the fairest system that we have. Because it's impossible to provide every want of every person. And so the idea that the job or the employer ought to be worried about that person. Now, I'm not saying that you as a boss or you as a person can't be compassionate and be worried about that. And I've even had bosses that, just to be frank, they were in a situation and I was in a job and they said, you know what, you really need to leave. They're like, not that I want you to leave. I'm happy that you're here. I'm glad you're a part of the team, but you need to do what's right for you. That wasn't in the interest of the company. But on a personal level, you can do that. But the company cannot be worried about that. And so you have to keep that in mind. Your salary reflects the value of your labor to that company. They're not charities, and they're not there to provide work for people. That's not the business of a company. The business of the company is to make money. And so because of that, you have to make the case, if you want more money, that your labor is more valuable to that company than what they are paying you, and that if they refuse to meet that demand, then you will take your services somewhere else. You see, nothing increases your bargaining power with how much you get paid than a robust job market. And having the skills that are marketable to other employers, competitors of them, that they have to say, do we really want Frank going to the other company? Because he's kind of a pretty big asset, so maybe we should throw a little extra cheddar his way to try to keep him there. Like that, being good at your job and adding value to the company, that gives you bargaining power. And so if you want to make more than is being offered, you need to be able to make the case to the company that that's what's going to happen. And if they refuse to meet those demands and your labor really is more valuable than they're paying you, then you will be able to make that case to another employer that will be happy to pay that for you to have that added value. And so that's the thing that they're ignoring here. If you ever have a job where they are required to pay you more than the value that they add, that is added to their company, in other words, their ability to make profit, well, then you're no longer an employee. They can't take a loss on somebody. They have to be making money off of you, or otherwise they can't continue to employ you. That's part of the reason that you're seeing in a lot of the service industries automation take over, because they've gotten so ridiculous with a lot of these minimum wage laws. And I'm not saying it's the only contributing factor, but it is a significant one, that you get to the point that, well, the robots, even though they're expensive, they're still cheaper than paying a salary for somebody. And so that's the thing that is being completely ignored here. And then another thing is that any company that has paid employees, they always pay the employee what the employees felt they needed as opposed to the value of their labor. If they did that, then there would be zero jobs. Because if the employees could just walk in and say, look, this is what I need, these are the things that I want, and this is what is going to work for me. If every business just said, you know what, you set your own salary, every business would go out of business. There would be no jobs. I'm not saying that companies have to be heartless and not care about people, because obviously I don't want to work at a place like that. I get that. But to suggest that a company is that, especially one that's offering $16.50 an hour, to suggest that that is what a company is doing because they don't ask every single little detail, or they don't adjust a salary to be more exorbitant, more expensive for them to meet the needs of the employer, that's unrealistic. For the same reason that you wouldn't go into your boss's office and say, you know what, the company's struggling, it's been a real rough year, I'm just going to go ahead and give myself a pay cut. I'm going to take less money so that the company can profit more off of me. You wouldn't do that. Now, you may unfortunately be told that if they have to do some kind of salary cut or something, and I know that that's terrible and that does happen, but that happens in a market. But my point is, you're not going to go to them and try to do that. And in the same way, they're not going to go to you and say, all right, we know that you're doing the exact same amount of work that you have been forever, and you're not really adding any value to the company, but we're just going to increase your pay just for the heck of it. Like, that's an unrealistic business model. You should be paid a good wage for the value that you add to the company. I'm in favor of that. But a company can't just set salary levels to fit your needs. First of all, it'd be unfair. Like, let's say you've got the same job as a guy, somebody like me, a single person, has the exact same job as a guy with 8 kids. Well, I mean, I feel for the guy with 8 kids, but I don't think that just because he has 8 kids that he ought to be getting paid more than me if we're doing the same amount of work. Now, I think that guy probably needs a higher paying job if he's got to feed 8 kids. But my point in all that is, I don't think that a person's salary cannot be based on their needs. It has to be based on the needs of the company, so that they can reach a mutually beneficial agreement. And then this is the final part of it. Let's review the budget, because I question some of the numbers that were used in this. First of all, nobody's asking the questions of why this is her budget, because that would be the first question that I would ask. Why is she living in a $1,600 apartment if it's just her and 1 kid? Now, I get that she said, well, this is a 1-bedroom apartment. Yeah, maybe it is in California, but I had a condo with 3 bedrooms, a huge living room, and a fully furnished kitchen, and it only cost me about $13.50 a month in Auburn, which is a pretty nice, very quickly growing area. And it was super nice. And it was less expensive than her rinky-dink 1-bedroom apartment in California. Now, here's the thing. I'm not saying that it's not. I'm not saying that she's making up the numbers, because it probably actually is that expensive to live in California. But I'm saying is, she always has the option of going to a different state, a red state, where they don't tax the mess out of people, and the cost of living is significantly lower. She has the option to do that. And so one question that we have to ask is, why is she choosing to live in one of the most expensive areas in the country if she's having budget problems? Surely she could find a job somewhere else that will pay better and she'll be able to afford much more for her and her daughter. And, that's one thing that we should ask, is that it seems to me that the areas in the country that have far less taxation are far more affordable and offer more opportunities than living in California like she is right now. So the first question is, why is she choosing to live in an area that has such an insanely high cost of living? The second is, why is she paying $450 a month child care? That, to me, is a big red flag, because one of two things is happening here. Either she has moved off to California away from family, friends, neighbors, church, all of those things, so that she can live in Southern California in a blue state that taxes the mess out of her. Either that has happened, or she's living in that city because those things are nearby. In other words, her relatives are nearby, or she has a church that she wants to go to that's nearby, something like that. Something is keeping her there, and that's the reason she hasn't moved, if we were talking about a real person here, to a place that has a more affordable, more reasonable cost of living. Well, if she is staying there for her family, relatives, church, whatever, it seems to me like they ought to be helping with the child care. Have them stay with a relative, somebody that's retired, have them stay with church. I know that there are several churches that offer things like that and do so either at an extremely low price or for free completely. And so that's another giant red flag that just seems completely out of place for what we're talking about here. I have personally babysat for a mom that worked at a hotel with me that just could not afford a babysitter. And I did it for free. And I know that that's a really sweet deal that not a lot of people get, but, my point is people find a way to make it work. And the idea that she is doing this and that freeing up that $450, figuring out a workaround for that almost takes care of her budget shortfall that Representative Porter is trying to present. It's not quite $500, but that $450 is a big chunk of it. And then here's another one. This is a perfect example of why all the things that on the social side that the left advocates for, sexual promiscuity, the breakdown of the family, all of those things, why that's a bad idea. Because even if you're going with this hypothetical, it would really help the situation? Having a second income because the woman is married to a husband. This is part of the reason that traditional family values that are often stomped upon by the left are actually best. They're not just best from a moral perspective, even though they are, they're also best from an economic perspective as well. Even to this day, the single biggest economic factor in whether or not a family is financially stable is, are the mother and father together? That's the number one thing. There are other factors that go into it too, and there's certainly even married couples that still live in poverty. That happens. But it's the number one deciding factor as to whether or not that family lives in poverty is, are the mom and dad both in the house and both working? If the answer is yes, typically they may not necessarily be rich, but they're usually not in poverty either. So that's another big thing, that it's her party's policies and social agenda that is actually contributing to the downfall of this budget. But, that is just a side note. And this is the big one. Why is it that she just really quickly glossed over? You'll notice that the only expense that got almost no time, no recognition in this video was what? Taxes. She wanted to talk all day about her housing, wanted to talk all day about the food, wanted to talk all day about her car payments and everything else. What she didn't want to talk about was the taxation that she just took right off the top. So even using Representative Porter's numbers, one of her biggest expenses that fixes the budget shortfall is the taxes from the state and federal government. And remember that her taxes are pretty high because she lives in a very blue state. I mean, they're high regardless because the federal income tax is ridiculous as well. But the point is, living in a blue state, that's going to be an even bigger one. So she's paying $5,970 a year, or if you're going to break that down into monthly payments, $498 per month. Well, if she's not paying taxes, that almost immediately takes care of that budget deficit that she's talking about here. And the taxes are going to be 17% of her annual budget, according to Porter's own numbers. And that is her second biggest expense, even more than her food costs. Think about that. This woman in this hypothetical that she's giving is, in her own estimation, spending more on taxes than food. And yet her party is the party of taxation. The party of let's raise taxes, the ones that were opposing the tax cuts in the last go-round. It's just astounding to me that she pretends as though that's not a factor. She just glosses over it and just doesn't pay attention to it, goes straight to the expenses, and comes up with this budget deficit. Well, you know what would really help her out and pretty much solve that problem like that? Not paying taxes. And it just amazes me that they gloss over that way. California taxes would also mean that she'd have to make, because she's living in California and because of the tax burden, she would have to make $21.50 an hour, or, if we're talking in annual terms, $44,000 more a year to make up that $572 deficit. So in other words, he would have to increase her pay substantially, not just a little raise, to make up $500 a month deficit. He would have to increase her pay by $44,000 to give her a $572 raise. That's how much he would have to increase her pay to get her take-home pay enough to cover those expenses because of the crazy taxes provided by the federal government and the state of California, which means you need a $9,000 a year raise to make $6,700 more. That's absurd. And I tell you what I would do if I were this guy. If this representative of the federal government, an entity that is taking nearly $6,000 from this hypothetical woman a year, if they're taking $6,000 of it, and I'm the person providing over $35,000 to this person a year, because if she's not my employee, she's either working for somebody else or she's not working. This man is the one responsible in this hypothetical situation for giving the woman $35,000 a year in exchange for her labor. And the woman that is taking $6,000 a year from her is saying, why does this woman not have enough money? See, if I were that guy, I would turn it around as like, because you people are taxing the mess out of her and taxing the mess out of the surrounding businesses, housing facilities that are causing those that cost of living to go up. That's why she can't afford things for her and her daughter. Turn it back around on her. Don't go on defense. You see, I'm not saying that would be a magic solution, but this woman would be really more than adequate in providing for her own daughter if you just decrease the cost of living by stopping taxing the mess out of everything in California and stop taxing her directly. It just absolutely blows my mind that the person that is providing work for her, providing $35,000 a year, is the one blamed for the budget shortfall when the person doing the blaming and pointing the fingers is taking $6,000 from her a year. That is the height of liberal hypocrisy. Let's go to the Daily Dose of Stupid.
No, you messed it up. You're stupid.
All right, and today's Daily Dose of Stupid comes to you courtesy of Elizabeth Warren. So Elizabeth Warren has been out on the campaign trail saying some interesting things, and we're going to go over some of them. The first one, it's not actually a new position, but she fleshes it out a little bit. So this is Elizabeth Warren, and she is talking about the Electoral College.
As a presidential candidate, what are your thoughts on the Electoral College?
I want to get rid of it. So here's my goal. My goal is to get elected and then to be the last American president elected by the Electoral College. I want the second term to be that I got elected by direct vote. I'm ready. Popular vote. I just think this is how a democracy should work. Call me old-fashioned, but I think the person who gets the most votes should win.
All right, so most of the things in that clip are incorrect. One thing that doesn't make any sense is you're saying that you don't like the Electoral College system, and even though it wasn't in this clip, it's in the same speech. I just happened to miss this part of the clip, unfortunately. She also says that it's a corrupt system. So you're saying that the Electoral College is a corrupt system, yet you're saying that you want to be elected by said system. Well, wouldn't that make your election corrupt? Like, it doesn't really make any sense there. And here's another thing, too. Typically, the reason that Democrats will give to the reason that they want to get rid of the Electoral College is that, well, the problem is that Democrats, who their support is largely in urban areas, and they struggle with middle America, they struggle with the more rural areas that have less population, they do better with the population centers. They say it makes it impossible for a Democrat to get elected. Well, if Elizabeth Warren was elected, doesn't that kind of break that argument? Like, if your whole argument is sort of surrounded by, it's based upon the idea that, well, it's unfair to Democrats and Democrats can't get elected because of this. Well, if you get elected, that kind of breaks that argument, doesn't it? It was the same thing when President Barack Obama used to say, well, the problem is that black people can't get ahead. And I'm like, you're a black man and you're the president. Like, there ain't anywhere higher for you to go. It was just a weird, you're like, the fact that you're standing there holding the office that you do is living proof that you can get ahead. And so it's the same thing with Elizabeth Warren. If she were to win the presidency, it would be a direct repudiation of the argument that the Electoral College makes it impossible for Democrats to win. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. And another thing, too, that I will say, I do think that she is right on one point. Because you notice at the end of that clip, she says, call me old-fashioned, which is another thing that doesn't make any sense because, you know, the Electoral College has been the only way we've ever elected a president in this country. So if you were old-fashioned, you'd think you would go back to the original system, which would be the Electoral College. So that also doesn't make any sense. But she says, call me old-fashioned, but I think that's how a democracy should function. Well, she's right in that. That is how a democracy would function. A democracy would elect representatives by direct vote. Here's the problem. We're not a democracy. We're a constitutional republic. And in our constitutional republic, part of the structure is that we are built upon the idea of a federation of states. A direct vote is not that way. This is the thing that people constantly forget. And I'm not going to go into a long diatribe about the Electoral College because I've done whole debunking videos specifically on that. But here's what I'll say about it here. I'll just give you kind of the brief summary here. The states created the federal government, not the other way around. That's what people constantly forget on the left. The federal government exists because the states willed it to be so. The federal government did not create the states. And ultimately, the states, the individual states, this is the reason we're the United States of America, not the United Peoples of America. Ultimately, the states are sovereign in the United States, or at least that was the design of the founders. And so this idea that we should take out the states of it completely and it should just be directly all the people in the nation vote, no, that's not the way that our system is designed. It would be how a democracy operated, but we're a constitutional republic. We've never been a democracy. We're never going to be a democracy unless the Democrats have their way about it and completely undo the Constitution. So that's another big flaw in her logic. She is correct in saying that's how a democracy would function, And if America were a democracy, it would be a very strong argument for changing our system to that, but we're not, so it kind of falls on deaf ears. Now, the funniest thing is when she made this case 8 months ago in Mississippi. So she was doing a town hall in Mississippi, and one of the things that Warren was talking about is, the fact that we have an electoral college means that people don't come to places like Mississippi because there's only a handful of battleground states, and Mississippi isn't one of them. Well, first of all, that's not true, because there were candidates. For example, Trump had no reason to worry about the state of Alabama. It was super ruby red. There was no chance that he was not going to win Alabama. He still came to Alabama a couple times, actually. He had a rally in Birmingham, a rally in Mobile. He came through Montgomery, I remember, because I actually saw the bus driving through there. Several of my coworkers got a picture with it. I'm not really a picture guy, so I didn't. But the idea, candidates never come to states like Mississippi or Alabama. They're not battleground states. Yeah, they absolutely are. They're not battleground states in the sense that you don't know where they're going, but candidates still come to them to curry votes. Hillary Clinton came to Mississippi and Alabama in this last time. And here's the other thing that the left constantly forgets about that. Battleground states are in a constant state of flux. They talk about battleground states as though they're the only states that matter. Yeah, well, that was the thinking of Hillary Clinton. And because Hillary Clinton thought, well, the battleground states are the only ones that matter, she ignored the Rust Belt because they're solid blue states. I don't have to worry about them. Guess what? That's why she lost. She lost because she refused to pay attention to the needs of and campaign in places like Michigan and like Wisconsin, which Trump won. And that's the thing that they ignored, that battleground states change. They change because candidates do ignore the states that aren't battleground states, and then those states become battleground states because they want their needs met. That happens constantly. And an even more dramatic illustration of this is, did you know that California used to be a Republican stronghold? California was one of the most reliably Republican states in the country. Now it's the other way around. The South used to be a Democrat stronghold. Right here in the state of Alabama, the reddest state in the country right now. We had the Democrats control the state government for 138 years. Swing states change. Battleground states change. They change allegiances. They change over time when candidates ignore, or parties ignore, the needs of those states. In other words, the Electoral College is doing exactly what it was intended to do, which was to make a true national election. Because I guarantee you know what's going to get candidates to not come to Mississippi and Alabama? Having a national vote. If that happens, you're going to see them hit population centers, and that's it. Why would you waste time campaigning in even larger cities like Huntsville and Birmingham when you can go to cities with many, many, many times that population in LA, New York? See, the Democrats want to do that because it'll be way easier on them to just spend their resources in places like that to get out the vote. They hate the idea of having to do an actual national campaign. Because the smaller states with less population that have special needs that the larger states just simply don't, they have to be paid attention to because of the Electoral College. And so it's actually the exact opposite of Elizabeth Warren's stance on this. Now, to give a little bit more explanation to my analysis here, I want you to go ahead and look at this map. Do you notice something? Trump won in a pretty big victory, but there's significantly more red states than blue. And here's the other thing that I want to talk to you about. The reason I'm not worried is because this map shows exactly why Elizabeth Warren's plan, even if she becomes president, will never come to pass. Because for this, you will need a constitutional amendment. To get a constitutional amendment ratified, you will need 3/4 of the states. Do you notice anything about this map? There are significantly more red states than blue states. So if you're looking at this, there are 29 red states and 21 blue states. You need 38 for ratification. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, let's give them all the benefit of the doubt. If you're looking at the map right now, let's say that they get some of the more traditionally blue states. Like, let's say the states that just recently swung for Trump. Let's say that they wind up going for the idea of getting rid of the Electoral College. I don't think that you can make that case that they are going to absolutely, but let's just say that that happens. Okay, let's give them Michigan and Wisconsin. And it's a battleground state, so let's even give them Pennsylvania, because it tends to have a more liberal population most of the time as well. Let's go ahead and give them that one. And you know what? Since Florida's kind of a blue state, we'll just give them that one. So there you've got 4 states. You still have 17. You had 17 that you needed to get. Now you're down to 13 states. You still have to get 13 more states after that. After giving you some of the traditionally bluer states, you're still going to need more. And the thing is, that was the beauty of the constitutional ratification system. They knew that the Electoral College was going to be basically impossible to get rid of, specifically because it requires a 3/4 vote of the majority of states. This was a protection that was put in place to ensure that states with smaller populations, and by the way, I'm not talking about only red states, Connecticut, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Vermont, these tiny little states that would be basically completely irrelevant in a national vote, it would be really hard to convince them to basically give up all of their power. Their individual states' rights need to be protected too. And that's the reason that the Electoral College is there, because the president has to pay really close attention to the interest of even the small states. But ultimately, this is just more red meat for the base. Well, for the left, I guess it would be more tofu. But this is tofu for the Democrat base. And this is something that, unfortunately, Elizabeth Warren has been engaging in for quite some time now. This is another clip of her this week talking about her inauguration. Before it happens.
I spoke and I wore my pink Planned Parenthood scarf. Now that's 2. So here's my plan for number 3. I'm going to be wearing that scarf when I'm sworn in as President of the United States.
Now, beyond the idea that it's horrifying to think that an organization that murders over 2,000 children a day would be represented, and actually the banner of that organization would be worn by the President of the United States, horrifying as that thought may be, let's table that for a second and just look at the political implication here. So what is happening with Elizabeth Warren is she is just throwing out things that are red meat, tofu, for the left. She's throwing out that tofu. And the reason that she is doing so is because she is trying so hard to appeal to the far, far left base, because she thinks that's what she has to do to win the preliminary. But I say that what is going on here is that she's actually killing her own campaign, because she's been doing this for months now. In fact, she has already proposed, we're not even through the primary yet, already with her proposals, she is proposing $3.8 trillion in new spending. And she says that somehow this is going to be paid for by taxing the uber rich. Now, keep in mind, if you tax every billionaire in America at 100% and don't just take their income, take their net worth, the combined wealth of every billionaire in America is still only $3.1 trillion. So she could take all of it, every last penny, and wouldn't pay for her plan for even one single year. That's how much she's proposing we spend on her plans. She knows that that's not feasible. She knows that it's not possible, and she says she's going to spend all this despite the fact that she is continuing to refuse to say whether or not she will raise taxes on the middle class. Because here's the thing, it's a promise that she has no intention of keeping. She knew that when she made it. She knows she's not going to spend this level of money. She's just saying it because she's throwing out more tofu to the left, and the left is eating it up. but she is doing so to her detriment. To prove my point, Kamala Harris backed out today. Now, what's important to note about Kamala Harris is because Kamala Harris started dropping in the polls about, I'd say 2.5 months ago, she really started feeling that she became a low-tier candidate. What did she do when she started feeling pressure to make more noise? She started spewing out every crazy leftist idea that she could think of. In fact, if you're looking at the amount of money that Kamala Harris was spending or proposing to spend, she was proposing to spend more than any other Democrat candidate. Her proposed spending came to $4.16 trillion, even more than Bernie Sanders, every single year. John Stossel just did a video on this that breaks all of that down. It's fantastic. Anyway, Kamala Harris had become the socialist frontrunner. She was proposing to spend more money than Bernie freaking Sanders. And she was doing that hard turn to the left. And it didn't help her. In fact, it was the last nail in the coffin for her campaign. The average Democrat voter does not like this. There are some that do. But the vast majority of Democrats are friends and neighbors that they're not socialists. They're still capitalists. They still like free markets. They just happen to be a little bit more socially liberal than us. They think that we ought to be a little bit more free with our money. And I'll still argue with them. I'll still tell them that their ideas are wrong. But they don't want full-on socialism. And the polls bear that out. There's a reason that Joe Biden is basically a walking corpse. I mean, he's literally falling apart. He's got eyeballs popping and teeth falling out of his head, and he's still leading the pack. That is because the average Democrat voter doesn't want this crazy socialist garbage. And when the candidates do that, and when they try to make noise and promise big, they wind up shooting their own campaign in the foot. That happened to Kamala Harris today. She's been trying to do this shtick for about 2 months now, and finally she just couldn't do it anymore. It was the final nail in the coffin to her campaign. Bob Francis O'Rourke did exactly the same thing. Because when he started falling in the polls, people weren't paying attention to him anymore. He's like, got to make a hard turn to the right. Or a hard turn to the left. Because you remember, what did he say? We're going to go after churches. We're going to go after the churches that don't agree with me on homosexuality. We're going to punish them for not agreeing with us on that. Oh, and you know what else? We're going to just take your guns. Heck yes, we're going to take your guns. We're taking your AR-15s. We're going to go house by house with police officers, take them away. Every radical, liberal fantasy that they could come up with, Bob Francis was in favor of it. And Kamala Harris did the same thing, and she dropped out today. Bob Francis started doing that about 2.5 months before he wound up dropping out of the race. If Elizabeth Warren keeps pace with this, she is going to do the same thing to her candidacy. And the dark horse that may wind up, I don't know, we'll have to see with the polling. The dark horse that may wind up being the beneficiary of Elizabeth Warren imploding like that may be Michael Bloomberg. And I don't know, we'll have to see. That he can certainly campaign as being more of a moderate than Elizabeth Warren, at least at this point. And he can just pour money into ads to let people know that he's running. I think that that's exactly what's going on. He's seeing how this field is starting to drop like flies and how the Democrat base just isn't into it. And because of that, I think that's actually the reason that he jumped in. So what has happened is Elizabeth Warren is basically Marco Rubio. You remember that Marco Rubio was trying to thread that needle and stand in the space between Ted Cruz and President Trump. And what happened? He was standing in the middle. He was trying to be like, well, I'm not as, boisterous with the tweets. I'm a nice guy, and so I can sort of do that. He was trying to stand in that middle ground between Trump and Cruz. And what happened is when the bases started splitting and moving further apart, Marco Rubio fell through the crack. I have a feeling that's what's going to happen because right now, Warren is trying to occupy that space between Biden and Sanders. Now, I don't know if it's an exact one-to-one comparison because Sanders, I don't know that his base is going to be moving at all. I don't think that there is much of anywhere for them to move. But the same thing could happen because Joe Biden's campaign could just start drifting over here and moving further away from the crazies on the socialist side of the Democrat ticket, and then she winds up falling through. I think that this may be the implosion of Elizabeth Warren's campaign, because this is exactly what happened to Harris and Bob Francis. They started throwing out crazy socialist ideas that scared voters. Within 2 months, their campaign was done. I could be wrong, but I think that may be what's happening here. This mad rush to the left so far has only hurt candidates. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
For this chaplain's report, I know I normally give some context or some background, but with this one, I don't think you really have to know a whole lot about it. This one just kind of speaks for itself. And so we're going to jump straight into the scripture in Matthew chapter 20, verses 29 through 34. As they were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed him, and 2 blind men sitting by the road, hearing that Jesus was passing by, cried out, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." The crowd sternly told them to be quiet, but they cried out all the more, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." And Jesus stopped and called them and said, "What do you want me to do for you?" They said to him, "Lord, we want our eyes to be opened." Moved with compassion, Jesus touched their eyes, and immediately they regained their sight and followed him. This is a parable that is kind of overlooked, honestly, in the Gospels. We don't talk about it as much because it's not as dramatic and there's not as much detail given. It's kind of short. It's at the end of a chapter. And because of that, we don't talk about this one as much. We talk about Jesus healing the blind man with clay. We talk about him healing the blind man that had been blind from birth. And there was the whole thing about the Pharisees and healing on the Sabbath. Like, we talk about those because there are more details. But this is actually a fantastic microcosm for the entire message of Christianity. And I think that it is somewhat criminal that we tend to overlook it. Because I was reading this story last night and I kind of looked at it from a different angle than I ever had before. And I was like, wow, I really never thought about it from this point of view. You see, it's a perfect lesson for how people are supposed to react to Jesus and to the world. Because what happened here is, when we have a problem, when we have a issue that we have to deal with, whether it's sin, whether it's personal, whether it's some kind of trial or struggle, what do? We cry out to Jesus. That ought to be the first inclination that a Christian has. You're sick, you're struggling with a particular kind of temptation, you're having problems with your family, you're having problems with your friends, you're having problems at work, cry out to Jesus. That's the reaction that you're supposed to have. Jesus is near, you cry out to him, "Please, Lord, have mercy on me." And then, when the crowd, and this inevitably happens, is going to tell you, "Hey, quiet down, knock it off." And your reaction to this should be exactly like these 2 blind men. Cry out all the more. When the world tells you not to lean on Jesus, not to cry out to him, "Hey, shut up about all this God stuff," that is motivation to cry out to him even more than you were before. That's what it means to be somebody that relies on God. And then the third aspect of that is that when we are healed, when Jesus hears our plea over the cries of the world, and if we are sincere, he always does, when that healing takes place, we follow him. That we cry out, we have that solution, and then our immediate reaction is we follow him, we follow his word, we follow his commands, we follow the church. We're all headed in the same direction. We follow Jesus. And that's partly done out of gratitude because we were blind and now we see. And it's partly done because that's what we want to do. That's what we ought to do. And so I think that this is a great little, a tiny little microcosm for everything that it means to be a Christian. Because here's the thing, the world is always going to tell us that this is not something we need to do. The world is always going to tell us to quiet down. The world is going to say, hey, I get that you're going through stuff, but keep it to yourself. You don't have to bring God into all this. They'll also tell you things like, look, God isn't the solution. You're wasting your time. You're wasting your breath. That's the moment where we have to cry out all the more, just like these two men did. And I was thinking about it. Why is it that the crowd told him to be quiet? Now, we're not told really, but the large crowd, I'm sure that there were some people that didn't like Jesus that were just kind of there for the spectacle or there to watch the rest of the people in the crowd. But it says that there was a large crowd following him, which would suggest that even most of the people in this crowd were believers in Jesus, or at the very least interested in him. And yet it's this crowd of people that have followed Christ and come to see him that are telling these blind men, hey, quiet down. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt and ask the question, why were they doing that? Maybe it wasn't evil intent. Maybe they were doing it because they're thinking these guys are bothering the teacher. They're bothering the master. They're bothering Jesus. Maybe that was going through their mind. I don't know. Maybe they were thinking, hey, you're bothering us. We can't hear the lesson. We can't hear the sermon because you guys are shouting at Christ and wanting him to heal your blindness. So knock it off. I think there's a couple of really powerful lessons there. First of all, the lesson to us should be when there's a person crying out for help, you don't try to quiet them. If there is a person that is crying for something, the first thing that we should do is we should say, hey, let me help you get Jesus' attention. Let me help bring you up to the front so you can talk to Jesus. See, that's what the crowd should have done if they were believers in Christ. And so I think it's really important that we not do that, or we not think maybe the other way, that, hey, these people are bothering us. We're trying to worship. We're trying to listen. Look, listening to a sermon taught by Jesus Christ himself is a very noble thing to want to be able to hear. But the priority should have been help my brother. Because it's a good thing to hear a sermon taught by Christ. It is a much better thing to live out a sermon taught by Christ. To actually do what Jesus was talking about and helping those in need. You can't get so lost in the forest that you can't find the trees. And that's, I think, what was going on here. I don't know that for sure. I can't see into the crowd's heart, but I think that's what was going on. I don't think the crowd was intentionally trying to shut them up just because they were being mean-spirited. I think they may have even had, at least some of the people in the crowd had good intentions. They were like, hey, he's bothering the crowd. People can't hear Jesus, and he's bothering the master. Jesus doesn't need to be bothered with these trifles. No, this is exactly what Jesus came to the world to do. To restore sight to the blind, to feed the hungry. That was his mission, and the crowd missed that. As his followers today, as the crowd that's supposed to be following Christ, let's never make that mistake. Let's never be so busy trying to sit around and talk about Jesus, talk about the Bible, talk about, get into these theological discussions that we forget that, hey, our mission is to seek and save the lost. It's a wonderful thing to sit around with brothers and sisters and talk about the Bible, but ultimately we have to remember that the only reason that is a good thing is because we're supposed to then go out into the world and preach to others. This crowd lost sight of that. And what did that crowd learn about their faith? They learned that that was what their priority should be, and it's the same lesson that we need to learn today. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2019.